Good day, friends. My name is Luke Beer. I'm the president of the Rotary Club of DuPont Circle. I'm so glad that you've all joined us today. We've had our news and information session. We've also introduced a couple of our guests, and now we have our number one guest, Dr. Jordan Potash, who's going to be introduced by Kristen Post, our secretary. Thank you, esteemed Madam Secretary.
Good evening, and thank you, esteemed president, for the second term, but we won't call you a president for life quite yet. We are going to be welcoming Jordan to our meeting today. He is a board certified art therapist and registered expressive arts therapist. But I think what's cool, he applied for a Rotary Peace Fellowship, meaning the scholarship, the master's degree or certificate that you can get through Rotary, fully funded. Unfortunately, he was not awarded it, but he did mention then, and we've communicated since, that he would be happy to speak to our club. And I was very compelled in his interview about his sort of passion, his passion for peace, his passion for understanding, the theory behind it and so on and so forth. And he'd already done an amazing amount of work and had a lot of firsthand experience in Hong Kong, I think informed in a recent way, but has also lived in and led workshops in China, Thailand, Korea, Israel, United Kingdom. And he's an associate professor of art therapy at George Washington University. So he's right here in the city, apparently surrounded by military vehicles as we speak. And I will hand it over to you, Jordan.
Kristen, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for inviting me. I'm super impressed with what Rotary does, and glad that we had a chance to meet in whatever circumstances that was. So I was thinking I was going to share a little bit of a somewhat formal presentation just to show you some art, some images of what art therapy is, the ways it can be adapted to peace building, and then thought we would end with some discussion, although I'm happy for us to take some thoughts and questions throughout. Before we start, I don't know if the tradition in this group is video on or video off. I'll tell you, as someone who's now been teaching through COVID, if there is a way that if people's environments allow them to have their videos on, that's always helpful to me. But if not, I fully respect that. Let me start by pulling up some slides. So give me a minute. And I have something to ask. If you could use the chat box for a moment, everyone. Before I get into the peace part of this, I'd just like to make sure we're on the same page about what art therapy is. So could everyone just put into the chat what you think art therapy is? Awesome. So we have expressing emotions, releasing emotions through creating something, releasing tension, stress, healing, psychological self-understanding. This all is pretty good. This is not what I usually get when I ask people what they think art therapy is. I just like to make sure that we all know that art therapy is a mental health profession. As of a year and a half ago, DC has created a license to recognize art therapists as independent mental health practitioners. Although those regulations are still pending, but the license is there. What makes us unique as a mental health professionals is that we intentionally integrate psychotherapy practices and theories with the intentional selection of art materials, facilitating art making processes, and guiding people to come up with, make meaning of their art in order to help them to achieve their fullness as full people, to enhance their relationships, and to better their communities. Here in DC, if you're not familiar, is actually one of the original US hubs of art therapy, where art therapy began even before it had a name at St. Elizabeth's in the late 1800s, actually. And now art therapists are all over the district, in public schools and charter schools, in medical hospitals, in psychiatric hospitals, and outpatient centers, and community shelters and clinics, including where I do my work, which is with runaway and homeless youth through Sasha Bruce Youth Works. If you are at all interested in an art therapist, some things to look out for are potentially membership in the American Art Therapy Association, national credentials from the Art Therapy Credentials Board, which would be registered and board certified. If you're here in DC, art therapists will be licensed as counselors potentially. But if you're in Maryland, they'll be licensed as art therapists. And starting by the end of this year, we hope art therapists in DC will be licensed as the independent professionals they are. And same with Virginia, because there are licensing laws happening across the country and in rapid fire. And if you ever need more information on art therapy, the American Art Therapy Association's got great resources. You can always write to me. I also just wanted to say, even though this was not initially part of my presentation, that just in light of what's happening in the world right now, art therapists are particularly adept at working on trauma. We're in touch. I'm in touch with art therapists who are in Ukraine, some of our alumni who live there. And although most of my presentation will be focused on peace building, my personal experiences extend not only to the work with the homeless and in psychiatric centers and the peace building I'll be talking about, but response work in disasters. A really good friend and colleague of mine, Deborah Kalmanowitz, really helped to move the field a number of years ago to addressing political violence and working in war zones and in the aftermath of war, particularly to help people to tell their stories as part of recovery from trauma, to rebuild communities, and to provide some initial just psychological first aid in the very early days of trauma. And I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot of this coming out of the current, what's going on in Ukraine. So I want to spend a little bit of time just giving a really different side of art therapy. There's a number of us who have been really focused on how we can move our fields for social justice, particularly for racial justice and poverty relief. One of my interests has really become around democracy and activism. As you heard, I lived in Hong Kong for 8 years. I was a trailing spouse, not something I thought was going to be a part of my life story. But Hong Kong became a very important part of my story. And we came back about 8 years ago, just right before the 2014 Umbrella Revolution. And although I was interested in democracy and peace well before that, it really showed to me what we need to pay attention to. And that all of us who are interested in the work of being able to voice to our governments, to tell marginalized stories, to make change, in many ways rely on the bedrock of democracy. It's something we take for granted, although I think in this country, we've started to realize over the last 5 years that we cannot take this for granted. And that democracy, while flawed and imperfect, is one of the ways that we can actually help to achieve more equitable and peaceful communities. And I hope to demonstrate the ways in which art therapists also can do that. So I'd just like to start by saying that all of us have a role to play in democracy, whether we think of ourselves as the politicians, the regular citizen, the mental health professional. There is something each of us need to do to help make people feel they know their neighbors, that they know how their government works, that they can participate. And in psychotherapy, sounds like, what in the world does a therapist have to do with democracy? And the truth is, therapy has everything to do with democracy. The very notion that you could go to someone and talk about your problems, to see a different perspective, to have the right to autonomy and self-determination, and to have some skepticism about maybe the story you grew up with, or the relationships you were in, or the way in which you perceive the world, all relate to democratic principles of the right to be able to see something in its own way, the right to determine the course of one's own life. And in turn, we as mental health professionals then have to help with the community organizing, with helping people to see that their problems are not just because they are personally flawed, but perhaps are the result of systemic forces related to racism, poverty, violence, and other forces that, when advocated for, can help to be alleviated in order to alleviate their problems. We don't need to adjust people to a poor system. We need to change the system so that all people can be healthy and thriving. And the arts in particular are just such an important component to this work of peace building and to democracy assurances. We tend to think about the protest arts, the posters, the demonstrations, and here in DC, of course, we see this regularly. And in another realm of my life, I could show you a whole presentation of just the documentation of art and protest art over the last 5 years. But in peace building specifically, there are models to suggest where different types of art can be useful, how different art professionals can be helpful in tending to conflict and to repair. I love this model, strategic arts-based peace building. Comes out of 2 scholars from the US Institute for Peace. They position art therapy at the very end of this model as professionals who can really help to rebuild communities post-disaster, post-conflict, in order to transform. What I want to show you, though, are some examples of the ways in which I think art therapists can work across peace at all different stages of conflict through the direct examples of work that I've done and with my colleagues. So I'm going to show you some case examples of that. And then my hope is that we can have some conversations about what you notice, what may be surprising to you, what makes you curious, and where you might be able to step into this as well. And these are the 4 ways in which I see art therapists as specifically being able to contribute to democracy, to peace building, to so much of the work that's important to all of you on this call. By visualizing invisible injustices, by providing forums for representational voices, by offering spaces to bring people together, and by facilitating activities to imagine new solutions. So how do we do that? Visualizing injustices means giving people forums in which they can illustrate and make visible the social issues that impact their lives. They may not want to tell their own personal stories at this particular moment, but they're going to help to bring to awareness in their communities, in their groups, in their governments, what exactly is impacting them. And so the images you're seeing here are from a collaboration I did with DC Public Schools for a couple of years with their Leading with Pride conference, which is an annual conference they put on to support LGBTQ youth and their families. And our job was to provide an open studio during the resource fair. During one year, we asked people to create images about their experience of the LGBT community that they then were able to share through the conference's social media. And in the second year, or another year, gave them postcards to create images, again, of their experiences that they wanted policymakers, their principals, or their school administrators to know about the LGBTQ community. The really large image here, a youth who described just wanting to show the ways in which she feels pressured and alone. And the other large image with the dog being a symbol for this person of wanting to show the loyalty and fidelity he feels among others in the community. And these were ways to bring awareness to aspects of the LGBT community that are impacting school children and adolescents. But another way that we help is not just illustrating a social issue, but by providing a forum for people to share their direct stories, to put a human face on a social issue as a way to move an audience. What is unique about the ways that we do this with art is that we can do this without ever showing someone's face or sharing their story particularly, which is important for certain groups if they are worried about their own physical safety. So in this example that I have, this is actually one of the big projects I worked on in Hong Kong. This was a project to help bring awareness to the stigma of mental illness. Worked with a local art therapist in Hong Kong who was working in a large psychiatric center, who as part of the regular time of their clinical art therapy, invited people, if they wanted, to create a piece of art that could show somebody else something about their lived experiences, what they wanted somebody without mental illness to know about their lived experiences. In about 20 drawings and paintings that were created by all of these various artists, there were so many different themes of wanting to show what symptoms look like, themes of wanting to show the hopes and dreams that they have, the ways that they wanted to show the ways in which their mental illness has impacted their relationships, and the ways in which they're just trying to get by and live ordinary lives. This exhibit traveled throughout Hong Kong. It was in art centers. Here you see an image of where it was in a shopping mall. But to make sure people actually stopped and looked, they were asked to fill out a very small survey to leave a note for the artist about what they would do, what actions they could take. And at another point, actually had people to create art as a way to respond, which is something I can talk about a little bit later. Here in DC, another way of helping to give people a forum for their voices was our partnership in Alexandria with the public libraries with their English as second language classes for immigrants. And as we were there to lend a hand as English language speakers for practice, and the participants were telling their stories of migration that they then also illustrated that went through the up in the library. Another way we try to work to help build peace is to bring people together. And this can look like a couple different ways. The first is to bring people across differences. My colleague, Albie Jimobwodi, and I, starting soon after the 2016 presidential election, while looking at the complete breakdown of civic discourse in this country, we're trying to find ways that we as art therapists could contribute to helping people to communicate on basic levels with each other. And we started a series of workshops at the libraries, at universities, at conferences, and other places in the community, in which we asked people a simple question to create a piece of art about some experience they had that led them to their current racial, social, or cultural political views. The point was to get people to tell stories about their experiences, how they got to where they are. Sorry about that. How people got to where they are in their lives, and to be able to learn how to listen to each other's stories. Not because they need to agree, but because what they realized, what the feedback we got consistently from participants, was one, that the art helped them to slow down, to reflect on something they never think about, that their views come from somewhere. And that if their views come from somewhere, other people's views come from somewhere. Comes from their lived experiences. And not just from one experience, but from multiple experiences that get all tied up and mixed up in a moment in which we are confronted with a difference, in which we are just moved into reaction rather than any form of reflection or contemplation. In another way of bringing people together, another colleague of mine, Martina Efojzi, who is an art therapist and also a minister in the Methodist Church, invited me to be part of a retreat for gun violence survivors. So these are people who have lost family members to gun violence. And in 2 days, what we did was a series of workshops to help give them a forum for not so much trauma processing, but a forum for being able to tell their stories, to create images to go with those stories, and then to take those stories to Capitol Hill. So in that, we partnered not just 2 art therapists, but 2 art therapists with legislative advocates from the General Board of Church and State, where our job as art therapists was to facilitate the storytelling and the art making. Again, use the postcard type size image with the idea that people might want to let someone else know about who the person was that died. Or they might want to tell this part of the story of what triggered the event. Or they might want to talk about the aftermath of what it was like to continue on living and what they want to see from legislators in terms of responsible gun policy and advocacy. And the last ways in which we as art therapists can help to build towards peace building is to help people move beyond their current situation to envision the society that they are looking to live in. In November 2019, I was in Hong Kong. I didn't know at the time that that would be my last time going, what probably will be for a very long time. And while I was there, I was invited to partner with an organization who wanted help to help their employees, all frontline mental health workers, how to process the political distress and trauma that was going on at the time as a result of the Yellow Umbrella revolution and the subsequent movements that were happening since then. It was not nearly as sensitive back then as it would be now. Now this group would probably be illegal under the Hong Kong national security law that basically can pick up anybody on any time for saying anything remotely connected to criticism of the government. But what happened in this forum was part of the day was spent on stress management techniques, and someone had written about using art as a way to process stress. The rest of the time was spent in having them in small groups create murals about what things were like now. After they created these murals, they went around and visited each other's murals, left some feedback. And then when they got back to their own, they saw how they could make changes to their images. And then from those changes, we came up with real world strategies as to what they might be able to do. This particular one here, the mural, the original mural, you can see on the left, the group described it as chaos, as a mess, that they didn't want to put a silver lining on anything. They wanted people to know that the situation in Hong Kong was dire and stressful and chaotic. And they wanted that honored and said. What they also realized when they came back to it is that there is power in acknowledging really what's happening on the ground, but that they can also add in some supports. So they gave this little yellow guy some friends. They first cut the little yellow guy out, made him stand up, and then the hats on top of them are symbols from the Hong Kong resistance movement, the yellow hard hats that came in to sort of replace the yellow umbrellas from the previous movement. And going down this list, you can see all the other strategies that they came up with themselves. So ways of moving from art making to real life solutions in a similar way that Hong Kong exhibit that I showed you from people who wanted to break stigma of mental illness. One of the ways that we engaged viewers is when they came to the exhibit. Again, I told you they made art in response. We actually had tables and art materials set up where viewers were encouraged to find a piece that spoke to them, that was significant to them, and to create art in response. What viewers report is being able to achieve a sense of empathy, being able to understand their own values and where they're coming to why they have stereotypes about people living with mental illness, and the ways in which they hope to move society in a different direction. In another workshop, we brought together viewers, so people who identify who don't have mental illness, with people who, the original artists and other people who do identify with mental illness, to create murals around the major themes of the exhibit. So I told you about some of the stories they wanted to show about symptoms, about relationships, about goals. We took some of those themes here, and a small group, you can see up here on the left, about 8 to 9 people working together to figure out how to create an image of hope, another one, an image of relationships, another one of obstacles. And after they worked together on the shared platform of just being artists, they then had discussions about policy directions, specific policies that have been recommended for ways to help change stigma, about what would work, how to make it work, and what they would be willing to do. Coming up with ideas on ways to enhance curricula, ways to give recommendations to the Parks and Recreation Leisure Department, and ways for media training. So that's my pitch. Different ways that art therapists can use what we do to help people achieve insight and self-awareness, to enhance their relationships, and to see their standing in the world in order to move societies to more equitable and peaceful places. I'll stop there and ask for any sort of reactions, thoughts, curiosities about this, about the ways in which art and art therapy can enter into peace building, or maybe into some of the projects you're working on, or generally about the field.
I'd love to jump in here. Firstly, Jordan, thank you so much for the work that you do, as well as such a powerful presentation. My question, or it's a two-part question. I've actually spent my entire career working in the marketing side of things with therapists, mental health professionals in the behavioral health space. So the first question is, have you taken this education and information online on social media at all to empower other people to express themselves in this way? And the second part of the question is, have you thought about, or are you actively creating an online forum where people can get involved and share their art online, whether it be anonymous, or if they do want to show their face and get involved?
Yeah, I love that. So I'll say all art therapists were working online through telehealth well before the pandemic, but I will say all art therapists have in the last 2 years, including me, except for my clients who are homeless, who don't have access, in which case I've still been showing up in person. So absolutely, there are different ways in which that is happening through telehealth platforms. I mean, whether that's something like a Zoom or through a text-based. And in terms of other forums, I can point you to my colleague, my friend Gretchen Miller, who uses social media as a way to bring communities together. She actually authored the only book on art therapy and social media, and has lots of ways in which creating online galleries, creating opportunities for people to create art and then actually mail it to each other, or to upload it either anonymously or with their names attached to it. She has lovely, lovely projects. It's not so much something I've been doing as much. The people I work with tend to be a little bit more not always having access to it, but I love it. And I think particularly in the realm of peace building, of protest and demonstration, it's a great way to show capacity building.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jordan, you really blew my mind right from your first slide, because you spoke about how democracy and art therapy are mutually reinforcing. And I, as someone who probably wasn't exposed enough to what art therapy could do, I always often thought of like art and expressions of art more as a bourgeois expression after a society has attained a certain level of established institutions, open and fair freedoms. But something you said in just one sentence about how therapy and it creates a space for openness, which creates kind of a space for change where you can acknowledge what's wrong. I had a really hard time as a young man when I went to Russia, because I felt like the society felt so closed and I couldn't really get in and feel invited, which was confusing to me, because when I was in India as a younger man, arguably a country far more impoverished, people were joyous and brought me right in. And I realized that was because they weren't scared of what I or my association with me could do. Whereas in a former Soviet space with a closed system, the people were becoming, cutting themselves off again. It was 2008, it was becoming increasingly more authoritarian. And it's not the type of environment you might say to your neighbor, boy, I'm feeling really bad today. I need to talk to someone about something that's going on, or, displaying any vulnerabilities. It was a society where people, in their past like generations, perhaps, thinked on neighbors or otherwise. Yeah. So I just thought of that connectivity of an open society and being able to discuss our problems. And yeah, it really reminded me how important it is as a personal endeavor, not just, and then that becomes an institutional reality. So thank you for that, man. I'm going to take that slide with me and definitely sharing this with a few of my friends.
I think a lot of people share that idea, one that therapy itself is a fairly bourgeois or upper class, or something that only people do once they're settled. And I think therapists ourselves have not done a great service in trying to change that image. I'll tell you, in the work that I do with mostly disenfranchised and marginalized young people, also adults, that therapy looks like lots of different things. And that the idea of trying to give people the freedom of expression, the freedom of thought, the freedom of questioning, and then support to make their own choices is incredibly empowering, no matter what one's level. And it's interesting you bring up Russia specifically. I'm a professor in the master's program for people who are training to become art therapists. About 3, maybe 4 years ago, one of our students, who is Russian, went back to Russia to run an art therapy group for her thesis capstone project. And that was specifically for women who were survivors of domestic violence. That in and of itself is controversial, like the idea of trying to, say women's voices matter. But one of the things that she found in just running this one workshop over the course of a day was the way in which people did and didn't feel that they could express themselves. And just what happens once you start to question a system, particularly the people who are made to be marginalized, that are made to be disenfranchised, who are told that their voices matter less, that we start to see where even in our micro relationships and in our health really dictates our social structure. And it's one of the things that there's a lot of problems with authoritarianism and fascism in particular, and totalitarianism. But one of the things I think we don't think of enough is the way it actually impacts every individual, because the goals of those societies are to make people fit into a system rather than what psychotherapy aims to do, which is to choose your own path. So yeah, when you said that, really, really struck with me, this one thesis. Now it's making me want to get back in touch with the student.
Well, art therapy, as I'm looking at it right now, is an example of civic society, right? People trying to better themselves and their communities by improving their own selves and providing systems that enfranchise one another. I would just say that when you're acknowledging that there is a problem for those authoritarian regimes, they just want to sweep it under, under the rug. They don't want to admit that there's a problem, because then they would admit that the government is failing. So
pretty much
as we as individuals become more honest and more brave and such, we improve our systems, I think is what I got from the two graphs there, and that reciprocal nature. But thank you, that was very cool for me, so thank you.
Thanks.
Is there another member that has any questions for Jordan? Yes, please, Kristen.
Yes, of course. I was just wondering, I mean, this kind of speaks to what we've just been talking about, but I was thinking about I talk a lot about cross-cultural communication, and I was wondering about when you work with Americans or Asians or whatever, if you can notice different ways you need to approach the process and invite people in, and if they're tied back to cultural. But then I started thinking, maybe it's also different when you're working with somebody who's close to their trauma, like a homeless person versus, or a person who's unhoused at the moment, and somebody like me, and who's very far from anything. And then I started thinking, well, what about authoritarian, societies? And so I guess I'd just love to hear, how you might approach it, or if you find that just giving people art materials is kind of a universal, invitation.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, Kristen, because I think a lot of people believe that like art is universal. There's not a single society that you can look at any time in history where you would not find some example of the arts, whether that's the original use of the arts, which is almost solely for healing, or like for expression, for everything else. Absolutely, it needs to be culturally responsive. Actually, the class I was teaching today is our class in cultural humility, which is to help students learn how to identify your own values and worldviews, so you can work, and where power fits in, so you can work across power differentials. And so that idea of being culturally responsive in all ways, and what kind of materials you offer, and how it is offered. When I think about the work, yes, I do here in the US versus Hong Kong versus China versus Israel, all of these groups approach art materials in a very different way. And for whether it's more important to express one's own individual problems, or whether you're supposed to be looking at more your group's problems, for example, whether it's okay to talk about a family issue, or whether that has to be kept secret or at least expressed in more of a metaphoric or a symbolic way. Ways in which therapy might need to be presented more in keeping with the upkeep of physical health and well-being as opposed to mental health. And then you're right, the ways in which, and this is where our psychotherapy training comes in, is what it means to tell one story when it makes sense for the larger context of their lives. And so, the youth I'm working with every week is not life is story after life story after life story. Some of it is immediate problem solving. Some of it is, I have some youth who come every week because they know that for 1 hour, it's the one place they can be, that they're going to be safe, and they can relax. And sometimes they just use our art therapy opportunities just to chill out. And it's not so much about telling their story or expressing a feeling, but it's just to have a little oasis of space that is very different than what happens like almost 24 hours a day for the rest, over the course of a week. And so having that sensitivity and that clinical awareness, absolutely, you're right, is important. But I also want to say, don't want to make assumptions about what's going on in anyone's lives. Just because someone is not obviously suffering doesn't mean that they are not. And so knowing as a therapist how to build that relationship for when it's the right time to engage different ways to look at one's stories becomes really important too.
Outstanding. Kristen, is there a 10-second follow-up question or?
Yes, there is. I looked at the art in your, I think it was almost the last slide. It was the relationships, hope, obstacles one. And the obstacles was like, there was a church there was a field, there was a rainbow. I'm like, were the obstacles in that picture, or were those the obstacles? So
there was actually, so that group, they just, unlike all the other groups, decided everybody would work on their own piece and then eventually connect them. That group decided they were making this image. There's actually there's a person jumping over a hurdle, and the background images, the church, the nature, I think the mountain, the sun, the rainbow are all showing sort of the supports they have to get over those obstacles. Good one, no. I appreciate that. You don't want to make assumptions about or project into it, which is a big thing that we do in our field, so that people tell their own stories instead of us telling them what their images mean.
Awesome, Jordan. I thank you. This is fascinating. This is a talk I'm going to revisit. I'm really glad that we got this one. And a reminder that sometimes you read the speaker's topic and you think, this is not going to be interesting for me. And then you come and it's the most interesting. So thank you, sir. Obviously, it was me that was being bourgeois and not involving myself in art therapy and having those cool conversations. I appreciate you very much for coming to join us. That was a wonderful talk. Okay,
thank y'all for the invitation. If you need something in the future, let me know. I'll say, if you don't mind, I may jump off so I can get a late dinner.
100%. Thank you. We're going to sign off here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. That was
Thank
lovely.
you all.
Awesome.